Good day, folks. Today's video is a discussion, and a lengthy discussion, on motor power. If you live in the United States, for example, power is determined by the different states, but for the sake of the discussion, it's 750 watts. For Canada, it's determined by province, but for the most part, it's 500 watts. In Europe, it is 250 watts. United Kingdom, Australia, and various other jurisdictions are 250 watts. The discussion is around whether there's any practical value to these power numbers. For those of you that don't have the patience to work through the video, let me just tell you up front that there is zero practical reason to select lower power numbers. There are experiments in the video where you will see that if you allow 250 watts as your peak power, it is essentially useless. The motor would be so underpowered that the average consumer would not be able to use the bike pretty much in terrain that's anything other than flat. And there would be a limitation on mass uptake. This video will benefit those that want to know the differences between power, how the legislation works, how enforcement may or may not impact them, and most importantly, if you are facing a purchase decision in your jurisdiction, it would behoove you to be familiar with the models that are being offered and how those retailers or manufacturers deal with the power situation. You know, you'll constantly see comments from those in the EU or the United Kingdom or elsewhere that 250 watts is ample and that the United States has got it wrong and that they're reckless bunch of cowboys with 750. But is this true? And these are the issues I want to probe and find out what you people think and give you my opinion. Let's start with the way legislation defines power. I'll give you some examples for you to have a look at. But you'll often see references to power where the legislation or the bylaws will say the e-bike cannot exceed X amount of motor power or X amount of power. What does that even mean? An electric motor has no intrinsic size. Unlike an internal combustion engine, which you can more or less measure by cylinder capacity, an electric motor, what are we going to measure? The thickness of the copper windings? The magnets? No, of course not. And this may come as a shock to many of you, but there is no accepted or standardized way of rating a motor. When a motor is considered 250 watt, what it means is that that motor can run 250 watts continuously without overheating. It's an endorsement by the manufacturer. So the manufacturers determine the theoretical wattage of a motor. So if you've got a 750 watt motor, it's going to have thicker copper windings, bigger magnets, larger size. In other words, it's able to handle a larger current and theoretically can run at 750 watts continuously without overheating. Now, even that can be broken down further. What is the protocol for measuring this continuous power? What gear are you in? Are you on a flat road? What is the surface? What is the wind resistance, etc.? Because I can tell you, most motors, if you put them under load, will overheat. You can take a 750 watt motor as declared by the manufacturer and you can put it under load on a sustained uphill and it will overheat. Specifically hub motors. That's a topic for another time. So what are those conditions that they test these motors under? I'll tell you, it'll be ideal. Ideal ambient temperatures, flat road, no wind resistance, no loading, and they'll give it a rating. That also theoretically means that every motor would be a 250 watt motor. A motor declared as a 750 watt obviously could run 250 watts through it all day long without overheating. But we'll get to that later in this discussion. So, an electric motor, and in this context, I'm referring specifically to e-bikes, are heavily dependent on the battery and the controller. Without those two variables, your motor is essentially just a paperweight. So for example, you've got a 48 volt battery, which is fairly common, and you have a 15 amp controller. That means 720 watts approximately is what that bike is capable of pushing out. That's the only way to see more or less what the power is, but you can overvolt or overpower an electric motor, no problem. Most electric motors will run a higher current. You can change the controller out to a 30 amp, and the same 48 volt battery will now supply 1440 watt hours. So that motor is now a beast. So this standalone figure of it's a 250 watt, it's a 500 watt, it's a 750 watt is meaningless, absolutely meaningless, without knowing what the controller size is, the amperage on the controller, and without knowing the size of the battery. I mean, logically, say you got a 500 watt motor and you change your controller, which will allow more amps to be sent to the motor. Theoretically, if you took the volts multiplied by the amps, it would appear as if you've got a larger motor. But of course we know it's exactly the same motor, nothing changed. So how do you suddenly, one minute you've got a 500 watt motor, next minute you've got 1,000 watt or more? Why is this important? Well, it's important from an enforcement point of view. I mean, I can have a 500 watt motor, I can change my controller, and I'm still in compliance. It's stupid. You know, there's some contradictory wording in the legislation. The United Kingdom says it cannot exceed 250 watts. That's it. They don't mention continuous power versus peak power. They do mention the EU regulation, and I'll put it on the screen for you to have a look at. The EU regulation refers to continuous power of 250 watts. In other words, and I'm not sure if this is intentional or an oversight, but they leave peak power out of the definition. So one can assume that peak power is allowed as long as the motor is declared at 250 watt. But in the United Kingdom, they enforce the EU regulation, but they insist that it's a maximum of 250 watts, without telling you whether they're referring to continuous power or peak power. And people are having their bikes impounded and crushed, never to be returned, because their motors exceed 250 watts, which is just outrageous. Okay, so this is where you need to put on your tinfoil hat, because it moves a little bit into conspiracy terrain. Many years ago I did an MBA, so I can't help looking at things from the perspective of a competitor looking for a competitive advantage. But those that don't look at it like that are just going to see conspiracy theory. But let's assume you're a European manufacturer and you hear rumblings that they're going to pass legislation to control the distribution and manufacture of e-bikes and e-bike components. You would then start lobbying for your industry so that it is in your favor. to give you an advantage over those that manufacture elsewhere. Now, it wouldn't be difficult to see that the higher the wattage in marketing material, the more appealing it's going to be to a consumer. Why would you go and buy a 250 watt motor if you can have a 750 watt motor? This is obvious. But the EU specifically mentioned continuous power, and this endorsement is on the manufacturer. In other words, you let the manufacturer determine what's a 250 and what isn't. Your legislators then pass legislation that says, okay, maximum continuous power must be 250 watts, and that motor must be certified as a 250 watt. But they completely ignore peak power. So what happens is the European motors are touted as 250 watts, but they are not. They peak well above that. What do they peak at maximum? Well, we don't actually know. They're certainly well above 600 watts. Now, if you're a US manufacturer or Chinese or anywhere else, and you have your motor and you go and launch it in the largest, potentially the largest e-bike market, the United States, legislation there says 750 watts. So you certify your motor as 750 watts. Now you grow your business and you want to expand into Europe. You cannot take the same motor and say, okay, it's a 250 watt motor, because you've already certified it as a 750 watt. So what does the EU do? It has a workaround. It allows you to use the same motor in the EU, but it has to be restricted and locked down so that the user cannot alter it. And it's restricted to 250 watts maximum. Why? Well, how are you going to justify it's 250 watts continuous and you must give me X amount of buffer above that for peak power? Because peak power was deliberately ignored. Perhaps the legislators don't even know about it. So there's no way you can bring that argument to the table. You think I'm going off on a wild goose chase? No. Rad Power Bikes is a prime example. It entered Europe and the UK. It restricted its motor to 250 watts. Look, they're well known for having underpowered bikes in the first place, because they treated peak power and continuous power as the same thing. But that's not the point. The point is, in the EU, they could only have a maximum of 250 watts. And that meant they were unable to compete against European or other motors like Yamaha from Japan that peak well above 250. And subsequently, Rad Power Bikes has withdrawn from the European market. Their reasoning publicly may be different, but I'm telling you, it's going to be a large part of it. And then to confirm that, Magicycle, they sell a bike which is very similar to a Rad bike. It's a hub drive, fat tire, plus others. And I sent them an inquiry. I asked them if I was able to customize my pedal assist settings if I bought one of their bikes in the EU or the United Kingdom. And I will put their response on the screen for you to see. It is locked down, it is not customizable, and it has a maximum of 250 watts. I can tell you right now, they're on a hiding to nowhere. Why would you buy an underpowered bike? You're getting a lot less for your money if you're buying a bike that peaks at 250 watts. As further evidence, I propose that in order to compete with the Europeans and Yamaha or other manufacturers that declare their motors at 250, You cannot take an existing motor. So for example, Bafang, a Chinese manufacturer, huge manufacturer, makes a mid-drive motor, an M620, but it's known to be 1,000 watts because that's how it's been declared. They cannot use the same motor in the EU. And I propose that they would have to make a range of motors that are different to their existing range, which they declare from the outset to be 250 watts. And guess what? That's exactly what they're doing. And it seems that they've capped it at 550 watts, which is exactly what I've been saying, is that it's been declared at a 250, but it's actually providing peak power of 550. Now some of you might be quick to say, yeah, but that's Bafang. The Europeans do not do that. And I would say to you, rubbish. You cannot change the laws of physics. There's no ways you're getting 90 plus Newton meters of torque or the kind of performance from European motors on a pure 250. Absolutely no ways. The most egregious thing is that consumers fall for these certifications without understanding how these numbers are derived. And that's where the manipulation or the misleading marketing or the scam comes into play. The European manufacturers have created a massive competitive advantage or a barrier to entry into their market. And I think China's playing catch up by making a new range of motors. Another issue with the power discussion and the consequence of how the EU wittingly or unwittingly has created a market which has a massive barrier to entry is that consumers, because the more affordable options cannot compete with European motor offerings because of the 250 watt maximum limit on those coming in from the outside, consumers are being forced to purchase European bikes. These bikes range in price from anything from $4,000 US up to $15,000 plus. This is ridiculous. It becomes an elitist toy instead of an alternative means of transport where it would benefit society as a whole to get more people onto bikes and out of cars. The other situation is open versus closed systems. So you purchase a European bike from one of the established brands, the controller is part of the motor. So if you have a problem with the controller, you cannot just swap it out, purchase another one and swap it out. You have to send it in for specialized repair work. This is expensive, pushes up the cost of ownership. Same thing with batteries. Rather than having standardized batteries, every brand has now gone down the path of creating a proprietary battery that you can only get from them. Now, of course, they think it's brilliant business practice to do this, but it's not good for the market. So those create closed systems where you are not free to be able to prepare or work on your own system. The more affordable offerings, which generally are Chinese, but needn't have to be, your controller and your batteries are standard. So in other words, you want to increase your range, you can purchase a larger capacity battery. If you want to replace your controller, you want more customized options, or you want to get more out of your bike, you can replace the controller. Now I can already hear people gnashing their teeth and saying, yes, but that's the problem. I understand at the action of the market that is using DIY to build bikes that are outside the legislation. Two things here. One, enforcement. And by enforcement, I mean speed. Enforce it, for goodness sake. And two, you can easily place restrictions on importers of these products to force the consumer to go for closed systems and to only have the choice of going for a small specialized market that are extraordinarily expensive is to kill e-bikes, which potentially have the opportunity of revolutionizing mass transit. And then we have the issue with the United Kingdom impounding bikes. Let's assume you get pulled off in the United Kingdom and the markings on casing happen to say that it's a 500 watt motor. Is it 500 watts? I mean, the discussion we've already had, I've already explained to you that a motor, in absence of the battery and the controller, is nothing but a paperweight. So somebody has his property stolen by the state and confiscated because the markings say 500 watts. No tests are done to measure the power at the back wheel or to see whether it's compliant in all other respects. It's outrageous. I can make that 500 watt motor a 250 watt just as easily as I can make it appear like it's 1,000 watts. Here's one for many of you. Not getting access to certain trails because your e-bike doesn't fit some arbitrary list of criteria. Thou shalt not have a throttle. Like, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that people that have mobility issues, that cannot start from a dead stop or in the wrong gear and need a little bit of help for the chain to move across, or you happen to have an injury and you need a little bit of help occasionally, cannot go on those trails because thou shalt not have a throttle? It's absurd. And they've done it because a tiny minority of people may be buzzing around at 50 miles per hour, full throttle. Come on, people. It's a tiny, tiny percentage. And enforce speed. We have legislation on the books for reckless and negligent driving or stunting or speeding. Use it. Next thing is those arbitrary rules will specify thou shalt not have more than 500 watts of power or 750 watts of power. What power are we talking about? We've already gone through that list. We're talking about power at the back wheel. You're talking about manufacturer certified motor power. What are you talking about specifically? I mean, if I told somebody that my bike is 250 watts continuous power, I would not be lying. I can ride it all day long at 250 watts and it's not going to overheat. And that's my point, is that going after power doesn't tell you the full story at all. You know, I've recorded over 350 rides. And I can tell you that my average power usage per hour is around 160 watts. Does that mean it's evidence that 250 watts is sufficient? No, because it doesn't take into account the steep rides where I could peak well above 300 watts, 400 watts. And that all depends on the rider, how they ride, how fit they are, how strong they are, conditions, and a myriad other variables. So I'm going to do an experiment for you, actually 4, because I'm going to show you that the focus should be on speed and not power. I'm going to go to a steep section of terrain. Just interject there for a minute. My controller is somewhat programmable, or I have the ability to customize some aspects of it. Not enough, but some. I can reduce the power, and I can use pedal assists that correspond with 250, 500, 750. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the speed limit, because my bike's restricted to 32, but I can reduce it to 25 to correspond with the EU, for example. And we are going to go and do steep runs. And I'm going to push it all the way up that hill. If I don't make it at some point, I can't pedal anymore, I'm going to stop. So I'm going to do that for 250 watt, 500 watt, 750 watt, assuming that these are peak numbers, and then I'm going to allow the bike to peak higher than that. And we'll see. Hopefully the battery lasts. Okay, first experiment. Maximum power, 250 watts. Maximum speed, 25. Here goes. Okay, first gear. So really pulling about 255 watts. 250, there we go, 240, 241. How far can I get? Oof, second gear is already a strain, and we haven't even reached the steep section. Back to first gear, 240 watts. Of course it can't peak more than that, so I'm pretty stuck. And we're not even at the steepest section. Right. So the amount of power I'm getting now would be the equivalent to what Rad Cycles power bikes would be giving you, or Magicycle, or any one of the others. That's it. Not going to get up the hill. I'm going to leave a marker here so we can see how well each level does. Okay, I've left a rock on the side of the road that we are going to use as our marker. Let's go down and redo the experiment with 500 watts peak. Okay, I've set the maximum speed to 32 kilometers per hour, which is meaningless, and maximum peak 500 watts. Let's go. Well, it's immediately easier to pedal. We're pushing out 475 watts. I can actually get to second gear. 475. It obviously is not going to go above 500. Oh, we're even in third gear. Amazing difference. Where's our rock? First gear. Here's our rock. We're pushing 500. We're not going to get significantly further. This hill is too bloody steep. Still going. There's no point. Not sure if you can see the road up there. All the way up the hill. Right, next experiment. Speed will stay at 32 kilometers per hour, and we will set the power to a maximum of 750 watts. We'll see what happens. Okay folks, peak 750. Here goes. Easy. $19 kilometers per hour, 20, 21. Will we reach 32? No. Currently pulling 720 watts. 710, 720. Far more usable power till we hit the uphill. That's the 250. I think I'm getting knackered. Because on the 750, we should be cruising past the 500. It's now getting really steep. I don't know, probably 15% gradient or so. Okay, final test is 500 watts, but I'm going to allow the bike to peak at 840 watts. In other words, I'm allowing a peak power component. This should take us, hopefully, most of the way up. Let's see. There we go. It's pulling about 710 watts. It's not really under load yet until we reach the peak. 700. $720. Right, here we go. We start the climb. I'm down to first gear. 700 watts. 800. 700. Can't talk anymore. There's his throttle, not helping. Oh my God. Well, I exceeded all of them and probably should have made it, or could have made it, on a fresh pair of legs. My point is, you want to restrict cargo bikes or people that live in hilly areas to 250 watts. They're not going to make it. Okay, I'm going to do one final experiment where I allow the bike to peak at 840 watts. Continuous is 250 watts. But instead of having the maximum speed at 32, because I'm going to get those comments, yes, but you were doing over 25. I'm going to set the limit at 25, and you'll see it makes no difference. Still perfectly safe. Okay, we have a maximum speed of 25, and we've made allowance for it to peak at 840. Let's see what happens. Here goes. Yep. And I do realize that mid-drives are more efficient at getting you up here. But that isn't the point of this exercise. The point of this exercise is to show you how far you can get up on the different power levels. Okay, you can see my speed is 23.2. It's struggling to get to 25 because the motor keeps cutting out as it gets close to that speed. And the power output is 500 watts, 550. Past the first marker, 700 watts. We're down to 13 k's now. We're at the second marker, still 700 watts. We're at the third marker. Oh my God. Okay, I'm going to do one experiment on a relatively flat section of road where I'm allowing the bike to peak at 840 watts, but continuous is 250 watts. Speed limit is 25. I'm not going to do the whole range of tests because you will see that the bike cuts out at 25 long before that power peaks. Legislators should be enforcing speed and speed alone. Do I think it should be unlimited power? Of course not. There needs to be a point at which you define speed and power as moving into the moped section. But you could arbitrarily say 750 watts is maximum for an e-bike. And anything above that and 32 kilometers per hour or 25, depending on what your legislators decide, puts it into the moped category. But for now, let's do this experiment. So it'll peak at 840 and maximum speed is 25. Let's see how this goes. And there we go, we're at 25 already, and we're only drawing 50 watts. 20 watts. I mean, it's ridiculous. It doesn't matter what level of pedal assist I put it in, as long as I stay at 25, it draws no more power. It's already peaked. So it makes no difference that you have that additional power. You cannot tap into it unless you're under load, which is exactly when you need it. Going up a hill, pulling a trailer into a headwind, or carrying a lot of payload or weight. So again, we're on a bit of a flat section, wind in my face, and I'm only drawing 25 watts at maximum speed. There's a slight increase in elevation ahead of me, and you'll see what happens. But this is why a lot of people would leave their bikes in pedal assist 5, because it actually makes no difference. Right, we've got a slight elevation, and power has jumped up to 330, 395, which is my point. 600, 700, we're still below 25 kilometers per hour, and it's providing me the power I need to get up this hill. 700 watts, 21 kilometers per hour. And that is it. If you want to make these bikes more versatile, you need to open up the power. It's as simple as that. Okay, so let's summarize. We discussed the different levels of power that are specified around the world, and how I think the way the legislation is currently worded and enforced is absurd. I don't believe power is the metric that we should be pursuing. I think it's a straw man argument. It's a distraction. The main issue is speed and enforcement, and of course it's difficult to enforce speed with bikes. So the focus becomes power. But it's useless without providing power for the different categories of e-bikes, like cargo bikes and so forth. There's never going to be mass uptake. The other metric that people might mention is torque. It's just as flawed as power. Torque should be measured at the rear wheel, and it isn't. With mid-drives, they like to quote these high torque numbers, but they're using the length of the crank to increase the torque number. You know, torque is a force multiplied by a distance from the point of where the force is applied, the pivot. You know, think of trying to tighten a bolt with your fingers versus tightening a bolt with a spanner. You apply the same amount of force, but you have additional torque because of the length of the spanner. It's the same as using the crank. So to multiply your amount of torque, because you're measuring it at the end of the crank versus measuring it at the pivot, it's just another scam, another manipulation to convince consumers that one has more torque than the other. So torque is a useless metric too. If you enforce the speed and you ensure that manufacturers comply with that and do not allow speed to be manipulated, and that they would be subject to fines and so forth, It doesn't really matter what level of power you put through. As we saw in the experiments, on a flat ground, you're never going to reach peak power, not even close. You'll reach the speed limit long before. And if the bike's under load, you're not going to be able to reach those peak speeds anyway. But you certainly need the additional torque if the bike is under load, which makes the bike far more versatile if you're able to pull a trailer, carry a payload, and so on. This certainly leaves it open for somebody to challenge the e-bike confiscations in the UK, or anywhere else for that matter. They're enforcing legislation which is flawed. Makes no sense whatsoever. It's poorly defined. Is it deliberate? Did the European manufacturers collude and create an environment where they have an unfair competitive advantage? Do they want to outlaw do-it-yourself e-bikes? So I look forward to your feedback. Thank you for joining me on the ride. I hope it's of some value to some of you. And we'll chat again next time.